Well, welcome everybody to our weekly Cyber Policy Center lunch series. We are thrilled today to have with us Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, who is a professor at Oxford and director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He'll be talking about his new book, The Power of Platforms, Shaping Media and Society. Welcome, Rasmus.
Well, thanks very much, Nate, and thanks for everyone coming out in person and those who are joining us online. It's a real pleasure to be back in Stanford after some years away. So what I wanted to do today is to walk through a few key findings from a book called The Power of Platforms. It was published this summer by Oxford University Press. It's by myself and my former colleague Sarah Ann Gander, who's now an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in Canada. And what we wanted to do in the book is to try to understand the power that platform companies are exercising in our societies through the lens of their relationship with news publishers, one of the many different industries that platform companies, in particular consumer-facing platform companies, intersect with. So the starting point is one I don't need to dwell on in a setting like this and with a group like those of you in the room and with us online today, but it's the rise of platform companies such as Google, Facebook, now Meta. They're equally large, though from the point of view of news publishers, somewhat less important because less consumer-facing, at least with information. Competitors, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple. These, of course, are the big five that the French like to term GAFAM, as well as smaller and medium-sized competitors, Twitter, Reddit, Yahoo, Telegram, Snapchat, as well as now increasingly TikTok and other entrants, some of them backed by mainland Chinese companies. The thing we sort of highlight at the beginning of the book is a sort of conceptualization of platform companies that start from something that's well understood in the business literature around platforms, namely that they are companies that have developed and maintain digital platforms that enable interactions between at least two different kinds of actors. Typically, each of us as an end user as a minimum, and then advertisers who want to buy some of our attention. But of course, there could be many, many other types of actors, complementers of various sorts, content producers, game developers, app developers, government organizations, private companies, social movements. Lots of different actors can complement and use the platform products and services. Now, because our core interest is to understand the power of platforms in society through this lens of the relationship with news media, we highlight beyond this that in the process of doing this, they've come to host public information, create new formats for it, and control data about it, and thereby they influence incentive structures around investment in public communication, including news production, but also, of course, many other kinds of public communication, political communication, strategic communication of various sorts, social movement forms of expression, and the like. Now, a lot of my work deals with journalists and news media, including sort of close contact with the profession and the industry itself. So I'll make a point here that perhaps in a setting like this is sort of front and center for how people think about platform companies and their role in our societies, but I think is sometimes maybe missed a little bit in the way in which the news industry and journalists think about this and frame this issue, which is that the companies involved operate under the shadow of what former Google executive Eric Schmidt called the platform wars. Right? They are one another's major competitors. This is sometimes lost, I think, in sort of the framing of sort of big tech versus X type discussions, that yes, these companies have things in common. Yes, some of them are very large, though far from all of them, as is important to point out. But even as, yes, they have things in common, and yes, some of them are very big, a lot of the time they really are one another's major competitors, and this structure their relationship and the role that they play in our societies. Now, what does all this have to do with news? Again, I won't dwell on much of this because it really is sort of the framing for the argument that we develop in the book, but it's important background just to make sure we have a shared frame of reference here. As all of us will know from personal experience, people who access news online often do so in a range of different ways. We might use search engines, we might use social media, we might use aggregators, we might go direct to news sites and the like. Every year at the Reuters Institute, we survey news and media users across the world in 46 markets, and most of them will say they access online news in a number of different ways. But when we then ask the follow-up question, what is the main way in which you access news? These are the averages across 46 markets covered in the report last year. Or this year rather, as of this year, just 23% of our respondents say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of accessing news. And a much larger share of internet news users say that they rely on social media, on search, on aggregators, or on forms of access such as mobile alerts and emails that are also to a large extent enabled by platform companies. And in combination, of course, these different kinds of site door access, especially those most clearly identified with platform companies, social, search, and aggregators, are far more widely used as the main form of accessing online news than going direct to a news site or app. And while intuitive for most of us in terms of our daily use, I think it's important to remember what a profound shift this is in terms of how people access and use news, right? Even into the early days of digital, the main form of access was direct. You went directly to the channels provided by the content creator, right? You picked up a print newspaper, you tuned into a broadcast channel, you went to a website in the early days of the web that you had bookmarked in your browser. But these forms of direct access are now increasingly superseded by distributed forms of access, where people access the information through the products and services provided by platform companies who do not themselves necessarily invest in news or produce any news of their own volition. Now, as a consequence of these individual and in turn aggregate choices all of us have made about how we access news and information, of course, the platform companies, in particular the largest ones, have come to occupy a very large role in the overall digital media environment, and as a consequence of capturing all that attention, of collecting all that data, they've also come to dominate the advertising economy. Advertisers were never interested in the news, they were interested in the audiences that news media could provide them with. And when platform companies turn around and offer them very cheap, targeted advertising at scale, advertisers are moving more and more of their money to the platforms, in particular to the biggest ones when it comes to advertising, Google and Facebook. But when you look at eMarketer's list of the top 10 sellers of digital advertising globally, 9 of the 10 are platform companies. And not a single one of them is a conventional content publisher. So we've seen this sort of big shift in how people access news and information, and we see the consequent changes to the business of news as advertising in particular goes to the platform companies. Now, as said, this is really just the starting point for our analysis in the book to recognize these companies have emerged, they have some features in common, they've come to play a central role in how people access and find and use information, and by extension in the advertising economy and the media economy more broadly. But the core issue we wanted to analyze in the book really is the question of what power as a consequence comes to be exercised by these companies. Now, some of these forms of power, I think social scientists have long understood. We don't need to coin new terms for every sort of thing that comes along. Platform companies have hard power. They are corporations, they have resources. Some of them are very large corporations, have a lot of resources, and they will exercise that power to fend for their ideals and their interests. Like any other large organization, they will hire lobbyists, they will have PR teams, they will have lawyers, and on it goes. These are forms of power that social scientists have long dealt with. There's nothing particularly sort of novel here, but it's an important part of the power that they exercise. Platform companies also, to some extent and to different degrees, exercise sort of softer forms of power, of attraction, while much diminished in the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the revelations of Russian information operations, increasingly detailed coverage of all the forms of abuse that proliferate on many of the products and services offered by these companies. It is still the case that in almost every week you can find, often on Twitter, pictures of prominent politicians from around the world who are sort of taking selfies with tech CEOs, sort of conspicuously displaying their proximity to these companies in a way that in the past we may have associated with other organizations that had soft power, such as news media, that arguably always had more of this than, say, similar-sized furniture companies would have. But there is something here that's new, we would argue in the book, and we term this platform power since this is at the sort of heart of our interest. And I'll say a few things about what we think our interviews with publishers across France, Germany, the UK, and the US of different kinds, as well as with people who work at the platform companies, might suggest about platform power, how it operates, and what some of their key aspects of it are. The starting point here really is the observation that platform power is deeply relational. It's based on attraction, on inclusive means of connection rather than exclusive means of production. This is somewhat different from mass media distribution controlled by a single publisher of every individual publication. It's also a form of power that is, we argue, enabling, transformative, and productive. And if there are any sort of social theory people in the room, of course there are social theorists such as Michel Foucault who'd say that all forms of power have these properties, but I suppose our argument is that this is particularly important to pay attention to if you want to understand the power that platforms exercise in our societies and what animates it. Finally, we argue that platform power is tied to the institutional and strategic interest of the platform companies in question, right? Even though we are inspired by the work of Foucault, these are not sort of strategies without strategists, as Foucault would have it. There are individual organizations that are exercising platform power in our societies. And some of the aspects of that power is what we deal with in the book. But the central point here really is that we have to think about the animating principle of this form of power. And what we argue in the book is that each of us as users and every publisher and other third-party commenter help make platforms powerful because they empower us in specific ways when we use their products and services. We have things we aspire to do, need to do, want to do. We embrace platform products and services. In the process, we become dependent upon them, but also empowered. And their power arises through their ability to help us achieve things that we would try to achieve. How does this work in practice? We highlight sort of 5 aspects. I'll just walk through them very quickly here in the interest of providing an overview of the whole argument before we open up for comments and questions and discussion. I'll use just screenshots of a few examples from Google as the biggest of the companies we deal with in the book and the most important from the point of view of news publishers, just to illustrate these different aspects. The first aspect is the power to set standards. This is an old example. Google for a long time operated what was known as first click free. The idea was that if you as an end user access a news article that's indexed, you have to be able to access the first click for free, even if normally there would be a paywall. From the point of view of publishers, this was an arrogant search engine that was abusing its market power to dictate pricing to independent companies. You can totally see why. You might be frustrated too if you were in the publishing side of this relationship. Now, at the same time, of course, from Google's point of view, this was a special privilege that was afforded to a subset of websites. It was a partial exemption from the no cloaking policy, where the principle was that you couldn't show one thing to the indexer and something else to the user. So from Google's point of view, they were using their power here to give a special privilege to publishers, but this has been a long-running bone of contention and has now been replaced by flexible sampling, where individual publishers can set their own rules for how many articles people can access. Beyond the power to set standards, platforms make and break connections. The most sort of visible example of this are the sort of periodic algorithmic updates. Of course, in big platforms, these happen several times a day, but the big ones will be named and sort of talked up. And there will be blog posts that in a few hundred words will try to explain at least a little bit about something that will impact millions of websites across the world. Now, often the sort of the early announcement around these will be very direct about what the point is, which is that there will be winners and losers to any such update, right? Ranking algorithms rank, that is the purpose of them. So if you make new connections with the same amount of attention, other connections will be broken. And this, we would argue, is a key aspect of the power that platforms exercise in our societies. A third aspect is what we call automated action at scale. I'm sorry, this is sort of a clunky phrase, but we were trying to sort of zoom in and just highlighting the technical side of this. I'm a social scientist by background, not an engineer, but I think it's fair to say that with a few exceptions, social scientists have not been that focused on the technical aspects of socio-technical phenomena in our societies. And we believe that this is very important to understand the power that platform companies exercise in our societies, that I can type in a search engine of my choice, as colleagues at Google would say, a clunky phrase like automated action at scale, and in less than a second, 164 100 million results will be rank ordered by a probabilistic assessment of the relevance to my search query. This is something sort of newish, right? What other forms of social power operate in such an automated way? Not exempt from human agency, no. There are organizations and individuals involved here, but the exercise itself, in the instant where it happens, is largely, if not entirely, automated. And of course, it's not only for me as an end user. It's also something that works at an interface between platforms and complementers. Here, an advertising platform, where again, it's largely automated. These are self-serve systems where advertisers or those who sell advertising create profiles and can conduct business without the kind of human intermediation that it would require normally to buy ads from, say, the New York Times or CNN. A fourth aspect here is secrecy or opacity or information asymmetry. Most of the platforms will provide some high-level description of how some of the parts of their ranking algorithms or products and services operate. This is an example from Google about how search works. And it gives us a basic sense of intelligibility of some of the key principles involved in search as the company presents it. But of course, even though the companies are not transparent to themselves, as anyone who works there would be the first to tell you, they generally have a clear edge over any outside actor in terms of understanding their own operations, and this gives them a power in our societies. Finally, and again, Google is a clear example of this, platform power operates across domains. The data, the engineering capacity, the capital, the brand that's accumulated around, say, a search engine can be deployed across many other domains. And let's say a map service or an email client or a web service with documents can in turn empower the search engine and the video sharing sites or other parts of the same integrated company. So these are 5 aspects of platform power that we discuss in detail in the book itself. The power to set standards, the power to make and break connections, the power of automated action at scale, secrecy, and power that can operate across domains. Now, what does this mean for publishers specifically? We picked publishers here in part because of sort of our intrinsic interest in it, I suppose, given I work at something called the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I should declare an interest here. But also, I think more broadly, because we were interested in this relationship through the lens of a set of organizations and indeed an institution in our society that used to occupy the commanding heights of the media environment and our information environment. Now, the starting point here is the point about platform power being empowering also for those who engage with platforms. Because platforms empower partners, publishers have, despite more than 20 years of explicit reservations about this relationship, continually engaged with them. There's nothing new about that friction. That friction's been present for a very long time, as both people at the publishing side and at the platform side would tell you, and indeed told us. The central dynamic here is that there are no platform opportunities, no ways of being empowered by platforms without taking on platform risk, right? All these different forms of platform power can be exercised on those that engage with the platform products and services. This can take the form of contingency or transients or these sort of whiplash reactions when a product is pulled or changes radically. But the motivating principle from the point of view of the publishers is that they have things they want to achieve too. They are pursuing platform opportunities and taking on platform risk, generally knowingly. What do the platforms offer publishers to incentivize them to engage with this? Again, I think the early pronouncements can be very useful because they have sort of a clarity that sometimes can be sort of polished off as the communication staff of some of these companies have grown rather large. Here is Eric Schmidt from Google 13 years ago. We have decided that the value we provide to the partners is the traffic. Now, if you're a publisher and you've been in the business of selling content to audiences and selling audiences to advertisers, you may not be particularly pleased with this offer. And indeed, at least one gentleman in the news industry, Rupert Murdoch, the executive chairman of News Corp, was not particularly pleased with this offer and pointed out that we have entered what he called an epochal debate over the value of content around the time of the Schmidt quote I just provided you with. Now, I think the context here is important to keep in mind, which is that as we consider that epochal debate over the value of content, most people every day show that they believe the monetary value of most of that online news content is zero, right? I mean, when we survey internet users in 46 markets across the world, most people are not paying for online news. And even the people who do pay for online news typically pay for one source, even as they use many other sources for free. And in that sense, it shouldn't be that surprising that unless forced to do otherwise, most platforms, big and small, do the same as a general principle. There will be exceptions to this, yes. There's been deals with AP, AFP, Press Association, Getty Images, and others. Yes, platforms will pay for things that they want to pay for or have to pay for. But in general, the terms of trade have been clear. The terms of trade are between most platforms and most publishers, and have been for more than 2 decades, that the publishers offer access to content in return for the platform's offer of access to audience reach. How have publishers then responded to this? This is another part of the analysis we present in the book. I think we can identify sort of 3 ideal typicals or stances that publishers have taken vis-a-vis the rise of platforms and the companies in question: collaboration, coexistence, and confrontation. Collaboration is based on the belief that this can be win-win, right? There are platforms that are complemented by publishers, and the platforms benefit from that, but so do the publishers who choose to engage. This stance is generally the stance of what other publishers refer to with some jealousy and envy as the platform darlings. A few dozen overwhelmingly English language, upmarket, internationally oriented news publishers, mostly headquartered in New York and London, that recur again and again when platforms launch new products, when they do product development together with news organizations, when they offer other forms of direct engagement with the industry. So for those who are offered the opportunity to collaborate directly above and beyond using the products and services, the view among some is that this can be win-win, and some publishers will very actively and assiduously seek out opportunities to collaborate with the companies in question. This is not the stance of most publishers. The stance of most publishers is what we in the book call passive coexistence. In the words of one local German news publisher we spoke to, "We need Facebook, Facebook does not need us, what do you expect us to do?" Publishers understand full well that platform companies are not forces of nature, right? They are human organizations populated by individuals. They have strategies, they have interests, they have ideals. But if you are a local publisher in Germany, or for that matter, a local publisher in Idaho, they might as well be forces of nature in many instances. They will change, they will do something new, and you just have to adapt. And you will passively coexist with platforms that, whether large or small, are beyond your immediate control and with whom you have few, if any, direct dealings. Finally, there is confrontation. The most prominent examples of this are News Corp. I mentioned Rupert Murdoch already. These are quotes of his, interestingly from another platform, namely Twitter, where he calls platform companies content kleptomaniacs and thieves. Another example is Axel Springer, the German-based publishing conglomerate with a large classified advertising business that also has publicly confronted some of the platforms some of the time, even as they also collaborated with others on other aspects of what they do. Beyond this sort of overall stance of publishing groups, we can also think at the title level of different kinds of strategies that inform how different publishers approach the opportunities that platforms offer them. At one end of the spectrum, we can think of publishers, whether digital-born like Mediapart in France or legacy titles like The Times of London, that pursue an on-site strategy where the central aim is to use platforms sparingly to try to convert people to loyal on-site users of their own news site, app, or newsletters. Versus at the other end of the spectrum, more of an off-site strategy, where, again, whether digital-born publishers such as BuzzFeed or legacy publishers such as The Guardian, yes, they would like to convert all of you to loyal, returning on-site audiences on the site, on the app, on their email newsletters, but they will also hold the view that many of you will never become loyal users and may never even come to their website, app, or newsletter. And the idea here is that they, for editorial purposes, but also with a commercial aim, will want to put their journalism in front of people where they are, off-site on the platforms, in addition to trying to get people on-site. Now, these are strategies that over time can help publishers develop different profiles in terms of how they connect with the people that engage with their journalism. These are not sort of, toy choices with no consequences, right? There is no absolute autonomy here. You can't simply decide to have a huge on-site audience or a huge off-site audience. You have to earn it, you have to compete for it. But over time, we can document different results here, such as in the UK, where you have some publishers, the BBC, the Mail Online, the Guardian, that have very large volumes of referral traffic from platforms, even as they have even more direct traffic. You have others that are highly reliant on platforms, with half or more of their traffic coming via social and search in particular, but still have a large volume, so a lot of platform opportunities, even as they had taken on more risk than the BBC, the Mail, and the Guardian. And then the bulk of the industry have low volumes of traffic, high reliance on platforms, in large part because they have very little direct traffic at all and are highly reliant on platform referrals for their online audiences. Now, where might we go from here? I've sketched a picture for you where platforms have emerged as an industry. They've become incredibly important for not just the media environment in general, but also news specifically, because all of us increasingly rely on them to access information, including news. And as a consequence of our choices, they've also come to dominate the advertising economy that used to fund a large part of the news industry. And in the process of developing these products and services, they've come to exercise different forms of power, some of which are well understood, but also the sort of newer form of platform power we discuss in the book with the dynamics that I've described. And of course, part of the issue here really is, whether you subscribe to this view yourself or not, is the idea that above and beyond its commercial value, independent professional journalism, with its imperfections, play a public role in our societies, help people inform themselves about the world beyond personal experience. It helps hold power to account, however imperfectly. And thus we have, I think, a sort of a wider discussion than just the tactical and strategic sort of tusslings between platforms and publishers over the role of platforms and the power they exercise in our societies, that also raise questions about policy and regulation. So I'll end with just sketching out a couple of possible roads ahead that we're seeing being discussed, and then wrap up quickly with some of the implications as we see them before we open up for discussion. At the sort of macro level, we've got some big ideas that are in circulation. Each of us will have a different view on what we think the sort of the tea leaves suggest about how probable it is that any of these things will actually happen, but the ideas are important to identify and consider nonetheless. You have increasing focus on enforcing existing forms of competition, law and regulation. We've seen a lot of this from the European Commission in particular, with much more aggressive scrutiny of the companies, much more aggressive enforcement, a number of very large fines against Google and increasingly others too. Beyond this, we of course have the idea, I think most famously championed by Lina Khan, now the FTC chair, that policymakers should step in and break up the biggest platforms. That some of them, Google, Facebook, Amazon, potentially others, have become too big and will inevitably abuse the market power that they've come to exercise. We also have other types of macro ideas. This is sort of specifically of the relationship between platforms and publishers that would argue that we should use collectively binding decision making to pass laws to force a change in the terms of trade, and essentially force the platform companies to pay news publishers for the content that they make available to the platforms. We've seen this in Australia. There are discussions in Canada. There are some European Union member states that in the transposition of the copyright directive are looking at similar issues. Finally, and this I suppose is an idea that is unlikely to find much support in this great citizen republic, but the idea of public service platforms has been proposed as well, most prominently perhaps by the then leader of the Labour Party in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, but not just by voices from the left, also some voices from the political right, such as Ulrich Wilhelm, the former speechwriter for the German conservative Chancellor Angela Merkel and later Director General of Bayerischer Rundfunk, a public service media organization in Bavaria, have argued that to ensure diversity and the chance for public interest principles to thrive in a digital media economy, we need publicly funded public service platform alternatives to often US-based for-profit private companies. Now, beyond the sort of macro ideas here, again, moving more narrowly to the question of news publishers and the sort of disruptions to their business and the risk of market failure, of public interest failure around investment in journalism. There are also a set of sort of meso-level policy options that are discussed in different countries. Again, I'm not suggesting that any of these are particularly probable in the US context, but there are other societies in the world where some of these things already are in place or are being considered. Direct subsidies for private publishers. This is a practice in some parts of Western Europe, interestingly, often in countries with very high levels of media freedom. Indirect subsidies, such as VAT exemptions or other forms of using public policy to privilege the business of news and enable commercial investment in journalism. You can think of various forms of systemic support that were considered many years ago by the Steve Waldman report here in the US to support a very sort of classic industrial policy, retraining, applied research, the use of public resources to help the news industry through a disruption and a difficult spell for the business, with the aim of enabling self-sustaining businesses in the medium-term future. And finally, of course, competitive grants. Again, these are in place in some countries where the model we use for arts grants and research grants in many parts of the world has been extended to journalism, where individual journalists or media organizations can apply for grants to power public interest reporting. As the executive of a major American news media company on the East Coast told us as part of our research, in his case, they were planning strategy on two assumptions. One was that print was going to disappear, and the second one was that the policy environment would stay roughly the same when it came to the relationship between platforms and publishers. So a lot of this, of course, is about the choices that publishers make, either individually or collectively. What are some of those possible responses in the short or medium-term future? We see more and more attempts at corporatist collective negotiation, where publishers who otherwise compete try to band together to negotiate jointly with one or more platform companies through collection agencies. Generally, this has been sort of somewhat complicated by the fact that they are indeed competitors, and there are thus very clear collective action problems, but also, of course, that there are competition authorities who might think that looks awful lot like a cartel and aren't necessarily particularly fond of what could come across as price fixing. But we do see some attempts to do this, and also some policy ideas to effectively enable the industry to do this, provided they can find a common position. You can also think of at least a number of publishers, though not the industry at large, and it's not a route I would necessarily recommend to established publishers, but essentially an approach that would sort of double down on the platform opportunities and accept the platform risks that come with it, and think of publishers as complementers to platforms. Now, to be very clear, a lot of the publishers who've tried to do this, BuzzFeed is an example of it, but they're not alone. Lat Bible is another company that has recently seen some choppy waters around this, have struggled to make this work for news publishers. But more broadly, we need to remember, of course, that there are other large multi-billion-dollar industries, app development, game development, that largely is about complementing a few large platforms. And also, of course, more broadly, that the whole so-called content economy or creator economy is largely about individuals who complement platforms in the pursuit of opportunities and accepting the risk and act effectively as what Gina Neff called venture labor. You can also think of collaboration between publishers to reduce their reliance on platforms. This is sort of particularly important when it comes to some of the back-end forms of products and services that publishers rely on, analytics, subscription sales systems, ad sales systems, where we are seeing more and more publishers explore at least the idea that you can compete vigorously for the story and also compete commercially in some aspects, but still collaborate with some of your peers in the news industry to develop joint technical solutions around registration, subscription sales, ad sales, or analytics, to reduce your reliance on platform companies. But fundamentally, again, even though publishers have many things in common, their individual interests and strategies will vary. They are competitors. They pursue different markets. They have different strategies. And as a consequence, their interest in what they want from platforms and what they would benefit from when it comes to how platforms exercise their power will vary considerably. This was a lot about what it might mean for publishers, but what does it mean for us? What are the societal implications for us as individuals and the societies of which we are part? I think the starting point here really for us was the insight that Jose van Dijk arrived at almost 10 years ago in her, I think, formative book, at least for me, The Culture of Connectivity. The dynamic between individual empowerment and dependency that characterize so many of our relationships as individuals with these companies, right? Gmail allows me to do things I would like to do, but I, in the process, become dependent upon it, and I shudder at the thought of what would happen had it disappeared while I gave this talk. But what we argue in our book on the power of platforms is that what we're seeing increasingly is a parallel and much wider development of institutional empowerment and dependency, where social and political institutions in our societies, in our analysis news publishers, are themselves in a relationship with platforms that is not fundamentally unlike that of which we have as individuals, that they are simultaneously empowered by and thus choose to engage with, but also become, in the process of pursuing those platform opportunities, dependent upon them. They take on platform risk. And of course, many of you are here today, whether in person or online, because you are interested in the questions that raise around platform governance, right? Not just the question at one level of how the individual companies govern the power that they themselves exercise, the individual companies exercise of platform governance, but also the idea of industry-wide self-regulation, the idea of co-regulation backed by statute, or the idea of direct political regulation of the industry as a whole. The things that Sarah and I would argue we should keep in mind as we think about this moving forward is fundamentally this driving dynamic behind the power of platforms that we analyze in the book. The dynamic where our individual and aggregate choices as end users, but also as complementers such as news publishers, is part of what makes the platforms powerful. Our choices over time become structures that in turn shape future choices. And also to recognize the particular centrality of some of the currently dominant companies, but also at the same time that separate from the question of any one company's success or failure or it being subject to political action or regulatory action or not, there are very powerful cultural, economic, and technological forces that underpin the rise of platforms. So even though I still meet publishers from time to time who wish they would just all go away, I am here to say no, they are here to stay. And we have to think about what does it mean to have a society in which there are such things as platforms and where such a power as platform power is exercised. And finally, we could have ended the book with sort of an exclamation point saying, this is what we must do, now we march. But that's not really, I think, where I feel I am as an individual or the way I think about my role as a scholar or I think Sarah thinks about her role as a scholar. So instead, we end with a question mark, namely, how do you think that we should respond to the rise of platforms and the power they exercise individually, but also collectively? Thank you very much.
Let me start with a question you've gotten many times before, which is, to what extent can we say either the internet in general or the platforms in particular have destroyed journalism? Now, in some ways, this is the response to this book, but if you talk to the folks at the platforms, they will fight, vigorously against that suggestion. What is your kind of canned response to that?
I think independent professional journalism is powered by, but not identical with, the business of news that we had. And I think the sort of commercial success of the companies that invest in journalism is a meaningful indicator, but not the only indicator of the role that journalism can play in our society. For anyone who thinks otherwise, I would just say, the commercial high point of American newspapering was the 90s and the early 2000s. Was that the high point of its contribution to society? Run up to the Iraq War, very little coverage of the climate emergency, things that were, put in the spotlight by Black Lives Matters and Me Too were not exactly, central concerns for newspapers that were much larger than the ones we have today, the run-up to the financial crisis, and on it goes. So in terms of the profession, I don't think it has destroyed journalism. I think journalism is many things above and beyond the commercial success of the companies that invest in journalism. In terms of the business side of things, the success of platforms have clearly accelerated the commercial decline of private news publishers. The way I always encourage publishers to think about this, given where I ended the presentation today, the platforms are here to stay, is to think about, as painful as it might be, how can one come to terms with a world that has changed fundamentally from the one in which publishers used to thrive. That world was a world in which the problem news publishers solved was information scarcity. No one has that problem anymore, so you have to find a different problem that you can solve. And how can you adapt to a change from a low choice environment where publishers had high market power over advertisers to a high choice environment where they have little or no market power over advertisers. None of this is easy. I mean, I think the top line revenues in news will decline for at least another 10 years. But there are a few winners that are doing very well, and I think we're also seeing at the sort of torso and long tail of journalism some really important, innovative, and creative ways of doing journalism that are enabled by technology and that aren't transfixed by the journalism that we had, but look towards the kind of journalism that they want for the future.
So suppose you're running one of these platforms right now. How would you change one of their policies to further some of the values that you think are in the interest either of journalism, publishers, the things that you think are quite valuable?
I mean, I make a general rule of never telling people how to do their jobs. I think that would be sort of presumptuous. It's always harder to do these things in practice than it is to think about them. But I also don't want to entirely sort of sidestep the sort of underlying concern. My personal interpretation of where we are and where we're heading is that even as the rise of platform companies have clearly challenged the business and thus the supply side of news, a sort of crudely put positive impact that platforms have had is the incidental exposure that means that in particular younger people, in particular people with limited interest in news, in particular people with lower levels of formal education, are engaging with more and more diverse news via platforms than they would of their own volition, incidental exposure to news. And I'm personally a bit concerned at this stage that more and more platform companies seem to have come to the view that news is too much trouble and not worthwhile from a commercial point of view, and for all the sort of political controversy that comes with dealing with things that cover powerful people, dealing with incumbent industries that will organize and lobby and whatnot. And I think they're paddling their canoes away from news, basically. I think that's quite problematic from a sort of societal point of view. In the United States, just from our own survey data, and this is sort of largely found in ComScore data and other sources too, something like half of American internet users haven't accessed a single news site in the last month. Not one. If platforms don't, in the process of all the other things we do with platforms, also help us discover news, as they have done for a period of time, but may not do in the future, I'm quite concerned that we're heading towards a world of greater and greater information inequality, and that would, I think, be a real loss. The
question is about the rise of disinformation on these platforms, and so the sort of worst of all worlds, which is the loss of reliable news and maybe the increase in disinformation.
Thanks for raising that. I think it's super important, and it's something where I've spent more hours than any sane person would in windowless rooms in Brussels, trying to work this stuff through with policymakers and others there. I mean, I suppose the way I would think about this is, first of all, it's a real problem, and it's important that we recognize this as a problem. The reason I state that, which may seem obvious, is that I think if we look back in American history and in European history too, we've had far worse problems with misinformation in the past that we didn't think of as such as the idea that I'm superior to you because I'm a man, or the idea that white people are superior to other people, or the idea that there was no such thing as human-induced climate change. We've had a lot of very serious disinformation and misinformation problems historically that we didn't recognize as such. So I think the recognition is important. The next thing I think would be to try to hold in one's head at the same time that I think we have every reason to believe that some of the platforms are making this problem worse. So for example, in an analysis I've done with colleagues, we find that sites that are rated untrustworthy by NewsGuard or sites that have been identified by NewsGuard as publishing false or fabricated information are significantly more successful in Facebook than they are in the open web. But at the same time also recognize that the majority of the information that people consume comes from established sources. So Jen Allen and co-authors from MIT published a study, I think about 2 years ago, trying to quantify this, suggesting that the average American consumes about 100 times as much news as identified false or fabricated misinformation. So to sort of keep that in mind. And finally, just to recognize that you and I will have views on what good and bad looks like. They may even overlap or be identical. But we live in irreducibly diverse and very disputatious societies where I don't think there is any consensus on this. And again, each of us will have different views on this, and that's one of the reasons that we end the book with a question mark. But I think each of us need to think about what's the balance between credible interventions against problems of misinformation and efficient interventions we want. One very efficient intervention against misinformation is to shutting up a lot of powerful politicians. I can think of one, at least in this country, or maybe more than one. But it's also clear that the reaction to such decisions suggests that they may in themselves further erode already low trust in shared institutions that we rely on to have a political discourse. So I think there are tough trade-offs there. And it's, each of us will have different views on this. I suppose that my personal view is that the more people who have to share a sort of an institutional arrangement, the more important it is that they have minimal rules that they all regard as reasonably credible. And I think that makes it very hard to crack down very hard on things that many people think of as their information, but that I might think of as misinformation.
I'm just taking on from this previous question and the answer you gave. You talked about, one suggestion, just a random one, that politicians could be taken off these media platforms. Or, politicians mostly are very powerful people. And as you said during your talk, a lot of these powerful people are also friendly with the CEOs of these platforms. So there is a kind of nexus there, and particularly, not just in democratic developing countries, but also more so in the third world countries threatened by authoritarian regimes, where there is an increase in the disinformation campaigns of which certain news organizations are a part, or hate campaigns. And at the end of the day, these social media platforms are towing the line of the government so that they can keep their businesses alive in those countries. And whereas some news organizations you can still take them to court for false information, for hate content, but the social media platforms.
What's your question?
Yeah, but the social media platforms escape any legal responsibility. So,
I think that the companies face lots of different legal responsibilities. But the question is, which ones of them are relevant for democratic discourse? And it's clear that they are not regulated as publishers, and I'm not sure that they necessarily should be. I think it's important to sort of think about what would it mean for Twitter to be liable for everything I choose to post on that. That would mean a very different kind of sort of content moderation from their side, to put it mildly. I'm not suggesting that I'm libeling people all the time, but you can see the problem, right, if they had to screen everything proactively because they could be held responsible for it. I think more broadly, the issue that you highlight is, as I see it, sort of where the future of the role of digital media in our societies is being determined is the power of platforms exercised in the shadow of the power of the state, where I think we see two big pushes right now. One is that powerful people are saying, do something about something or else, and at the same time they're saying, but do nothing about me, because what I do is always legitimate. Unless you can prove by the letter of the law that it's not. So a sort of a simultaneous push to limit private companies' ability to content moderate powerful people while expanding all the ways in which those companies are being either directly or by sort of back channel routes told what to do about other people's speech, often in ways that make the opacity of private companies' content moderation look like sort of dazzling transparency by comparison to how governments and law enforcement and others go to the companies and say, do something about something or else.
A quick question for the older people in the room, and then an observation I'd like to get response to. The quick question is, I noticed in your slide that showed how people get their news that there was no bar for print, and I was wondering if you just didn't ask about that or whether it was so small that it wasn't relevant in your calculation.
6% of our respondents last year say that, this year, sorry, in 2022, say that they've used print in the last week.
Okay, great, thank you. The observation is, one thing you didn't mention is how the platforms have affected the media industry is also by wiping out barriers to entry. And so the things that used to protect us, cost of printing, delivery, broadcast are all gone. And so when you talk about policies that will support journalism and journalists, I think it raises sticky questions about how do you even define what a journalist is? And there are a number of people now who claim to be journalists who are stretching standards. And so I'm curious if you could talk about whether there's thought by you or others on even how you set that bar and how you would set those parameters.
Thank you. Super important, and again, it's one of those sort of thorny issues when it comes from sort of sloganeering to actual sort of implementable policy. Let me give an example, not out of sort of flag-waving patriotism. I happen to be from Denmark because I think that the policies that are in place in Denmark give an example of what this could look like. In Denmark, if you register as a news publisher, you take upon yourself sort of self-regulatory responsibilities that also give you some privileges that in this country are sort of known as shield laws, for example, for protection of sources, and a sort of general expectation that the courts think a little bit differently about how they deal with what you might publish unless the other party can sort of prove malicious intent. But of course, and in the process of that, you also come to qualify for the direct and indirect subsidies. Now, historically, it was very simple. Freedom of press for those who had a press, right? And there weren't that many. Now, I look around and people here come from different parts of the world, and you may have different views on the newspaper industry in your own country or about individual newspapers in any country, including this one. But in a sense, it was simple. There was those who published newspapers were the newspaper industry. Now it's more complicated, but I think in this sense, if the profession and the industry is willing to play an active role in making these decisions, they have the power to do so. Right now, it's extremely, in practice, it's extremely widespread. There is a resistance in the profession, and I understand why, to licensing of journalists. I understand the reasons why, but we also need to recognize this has consequences, right? You can't really use public policy to support something that refuses to define itself and don't want policymakers to define it either. The industry itself also is a big tent. It's a reflection of that is in this country, the New York Times and Fox News and The Guardian and the Daily Caller, they lobby together in Digital Content Next. And they may not otherwise think that they have much in common, but they do all consider themselves to be in the news industry. So I think it's really incumbent on the profession and the industry to make a decision about, do we want to sort of stay with a status quo where no one gets to define this and these are just words we use? Or do we want to take it upon ourselves to define it, in particular if we claim special privileges? Or, this is not a route I would recommend, do we want to leave it to policymakers to define who a journalist is or who a publisher is? That route I have a lot of reservations about myself.
So on the Zoom, we have a question about, which I'm going to sort of summarize as, are all platforms created equal? Now, obviously they're not, in that but part of the question is whether the analysis applies to because you have Apple and Amazon up there, and I'm sure you've thought about this, and part of the way the questioner puts it is thinking about those who have chokeholds on the hardware also, and the App Store. We can think about other different layers of the stack. How should we, and for that matter, even between Meta and Alphabet or Facebook and Google, a search engine is different than a news feed. sort of, are all of these platforms really posing the same kind of dangers or same kind of dynamics that you're talking about, or should we maybe break down the platforms into sort of different sort of types of, I don't know, affordances or systems?
Thanks. I think I was once told by a sociology professor of mine that there are lumpers and splitters in the world, and that also means that there are sort of meta-lumpers who divide the world into lumpers and splitters. And I suppose that my inclination is always to be a splitter, but I also feel like we're in the sort of the early days of the sort of social science conceptualizations of platforms and the empirical mapping of where they operate and how they operate. So I'm all for splitting, but we've got to start somewhere. And I think the central point that I would highlight in response to the question is that while, as I'm sure the questioner is implying, all platforms are not equal. Some of them are very large, others are not. Some of them have dominant positions in particular parts of the digital media space, others don't. I think the key thing I would say is that at least Sarah and I would offer up the idea of platform power, the aspects I've talked about, the dynamics I've talked about today, as a possible starting point for empirical analysis, irrespectively of whether the platform is very large, medium-sized, or small, right? And no matter where in the stack it might operate. Cloudflare faces some of these things. Twitter faces some of these things. Twitter has no chokehold on anything, as their sort of business situation shows, and yet they still exercise platform power, right? So I think it's an empirical question, and I think we're in the beginning, really, of understanding that. Also, of course, importantly, as I think was implied in your question, to compare platforms, but also compare how platforms carry themselves in different parts of the world. And I think we have every reason to believe, through the reporting of your colleague, Jeff Horowitz, and many others, that they don't necessarily invest the same resources in content moderation in different parts of the world, or deal with political pressures the same way in different parts of the world.
Well, great. Thank you so much.